This is Monday Morning QB, June 28, 2021. I'm Askia Mohammed. Iran's newly elected president last week offered his first public remarks, refusing to meet directly with U.S. President Biden and ruling out negotiations on missiles and proxy militias. What does a hardline return to power mean for attempts to revive the 2015 nuclear deal and for Iran's reformist movement? Reporter Chris Banger-Drowns has more.
Conservative jurist Ebrahim Raisi was elected with over 62% of the vote earlier this month to replace outgoing moderate President Hassan Rouhani. Raisi and Rouhani hail from distinct sides of the Iranian political spectrum, with Rouhani's openness to the West a foil to Raisi's Western skepticism. But Raisi's recent election was marred by historically low turnout, due in part to voter disenchantment following the disqualification of several moderate and reformist candidates. But election manipulation by the Iranian regime isn't the only culprit of low turnout, according to Trita Parsi, executive vice president at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Parsi emphasizes the credibility crisis in Iran following Donald Trump's betrayal of the 2015 nuclear deal, also known as the JCPOA.
This time around, there were signs that the population, even if other candidates had been approved, that there would still be a massive apathy in the population and that they would not be as inclined to go and vote because they had lost faith, not just in the system, as many people would argue in Washington, but what really they lost faith in was the idea that reformists / centrists / moderates would be able to bring about the type of positive change that they were looking for by pursuing engagement with the West. This is, I think, a very important point. It is not just that they really cheated and manipulated. It's the fact that for 4 years, the Trump administration really discredited and hurt the elements in Iran around Rouhani who had for quite some time argued that the United States and Iran need to resolve their tensions, that if Iran meets the US halfway, the US would do so as well, sanctions would be lifted, and the economic prospects for the country would end up becoming much more positive. That seemed to have been a gamble that worked out for the first 2 years when Obama was in power after the JCPOA. But once Trump came in, he pulled the plug on the JCPOA. He betrayed the agreement, he pulled out of it, he reimposed sanctions, and the Iranians ended up in a situation in which they were under more sanctions once they had signed the JCPOA than even before they had even started negotiating. The hardliners for 4 years did not blame Trump for this. They blamed Rouhani, they blamed the reformists and the centrists and said, everyone knew the United States would do this. You are at fault because you trusted the US. You brought this damage to the Iranian economy and to the people because of your naivety. And it seems to have, after a while, resonated with the population because they're so frustrated on the tremendously difficult economic situation. 10 million Iranians were pushed into poverty as a result of these sanctions. And it's not to say that Trump wasn't at fault. It's to say that you should have known that the US would have done this, and you still went along with it because you're so naive. That argument seemed to really have caught on and undermined the centrists and the moderates to the point in which when they tried to mobilize people around one of the non-conservative candidates, it really did not end up working. People stayed home nevertheless.
Is there a clear path to political power for reformists then, given this delegitimization of the reformist movement and the disqualification of their candidates?
They're, trying to figure that out right now. I think one of the best cards they have is that at the end of the day, what's the alternative? Some people on the outside want to see an outside revolution. We've seen no signs that the population is ready for yet another revolution. They had one 4 decades ago. It ended up in a rather disastrous way. And as a result, precisely because of the high cost and the low likelihood of success of a revolution, the low likelihood of success but low cost strategy of some form of reform has nevertheless ended up being what the population is by default going towards, even though they may not be happy about it. They may complain endlessly about it. They may not in any way, shape, or form be happy that they're in that situation in which these are their only options. But that is still the option that they seem to be taking, because even the sign of not participating in the elections and not casting a vote is quite different from going out in the streets and calling for a revolution.
So Ebrahim Raisi gave his first press conference on Monday, and as you noted, it featured lots of hardline rhetoric, a refusal to meet directly with President Biden, a refusal to negotiate on Iran's missile and proxy militia programs. But you also note that he didn't really express any significant shift from traditional Iranian foreign policy. And given this, hardline tone, but seeming stability in policy content, can we expect any major shift in these ongoing negotiations to attempt to renew the nuclear deal in Vienna?
I think a return to the JCPOA is going to follow pretty much the same red lines for both sides. And it's not going to be different. And by the way, there's a likelihood that they may come to an agreement during this summer when Rouhani is still the president, because Raisi will not become president until first week of August. After that, I think if there's anything that I think will be most problematic from an American perspective with Rouhani coming in terms of the JCPOA, is that the United States wants to see a quick readdressing of the timeline and some of the elements of the deal once the US is back in the deal. Not like Trump wanted to renegotiate from the outside. They want to do this from the inside. And they want to, as they have called it, make it longer and stronger. I've seen no indication that the Iranians, whether with Raisi or Rouhani, but even less so with Raisi, would be open to such a renegotiation at an early stage. They, at best, I think, would like to see that happening perhaps after 2 years or after the next president has come in, for the simple reason that they believe, and I think they have some legitimacy here, that the US has proven itself to be untrustworthy. And they're not going to go along with a longer and stronger deal when the US hasn't even lived up to the original deal and have made no compensation for having damaged Iran's economy for 4 years so blatantly for having violated the deal, for the US violating. So they may be more firm in the position that they'll do it, but they want to see that the US has lived up to its word first. And that in and of itself means potentially waiting till the next president, because the real test from the Iranian side is not that Biden will adhere to the agreement. I think that they probably feel that that is quite likely. The question is, will Ted Cruz abide by the agreement? Will Tom Cotton abide by the agreement? Will the potential next Republican president abide by the agreement?
You've said that Iran has begun a pivot to Asia and that Raisi will continue that trend. What could the relationship between Iran and the East, maybe particularly China, look like over the coming decade? And what does that mean for the Western exercise of power in Central Asia?
So I think a very different situation that exists today compared to 2013 when these negotiations got serious, or 2015 when they were signed, is that back then the Iranians would perhaps like to think that they had a China option, that they didn't have to rely on the West for economic benefit and trade and investment, but it didn't really exist in reality. Today, I think we are in a very different situation. It's remarkable how fast things have changed. The benefits that the West had over China, if you look back 20 years, was that the United States and the West in general had a technical superiority. which made it a no-brainer as to why that was a more optimal orientation. The United States had finances which the Chinese could not offer. And the United States was largely the gatekeeper of who is a legitimate player, who is inside the international community, and who is a pariah. I think all three of them have, to a certain extent, either been lost or weakened. The US no longer has that unquestionable role of being able to decide who is and who's not a rogue player, to a very large extent because the United States was an exceedingly rogue player for the last 4 years. To now suddenly just make a declaration, America is back, doesn't change anything. We've already walked away from that. That world is not going to return very easily. And I think an aspect of this is the Chinese did not have any incentives to be particularly challenging of the United States diplomatically and politically. Their calculations seem to have been time is on their side. It's much better for them to wait than to pick a fight with the US. Trump again changed that. He very explicitly picked the fight with the Chinese. And the Chinese now made a decision that they're going to fight back. We've seen the tone in some of the recent meetings. We've seen how the Chinese are challenging and retaliating against American sanctions in a way that they didn't do before. So we're in a world right now in which the Chinese are much more willing to put up a political fight against the United States. That changes things for Iran. Because in the past, the Chinese may not have been in agreement with what the US was doing, but did they put in a veto at the UN Security Council to stop the United States from imposing a new sanctions resolution on Iran? They did not. Did they put a veto at the IEA board not to refer the matter to the Security Council? They did not. They were not willing to pick those fights with the United States. Because even if they, on substance, may have agreed with Iran, they were not going to impose that cost on themselves. Now they seem, largely because we decided that we're going to have a fight with the Chinese, they seem to think that they need to fight back. And whether that means that they fight back on their own issues or every once in a while poke at the US by supporting the Iranians or others seems to be an option now. And that, again, reduces the US's maneuverability and its ability to corner Iran. I mean, to a large extent, part of the reason why the JCPOA ended up becoming successful is because the Obama administration managed to get a consensus amongst the entire P5+1 on how to deal with Iran. And then the Iranians couldn't play the different parties against each other. Can you imagine that happening today?
That's Trita Parsi, Executive Vice President at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Learn more about his work by visiting quincyinst.org. For Monday Morning QB, I'm Chris Bangert-Drowns.